It is Sunday, the 16th of March, 2025, and whenever I share a screen from another internet provider, I have to go to it and keep on the big screen in order for it to play. Anytime I go back to my studio, I'm not able to, so anyway. Here's the rest of False Flags.
He waged war in Yemen along with the Saudi government, who had supported and fostered terror groups in the region for years.
Documents obtained by Reuters show the U.S. government's concerned it could be implicated in potential war crimes in Yemen because of its support for a Saudi-led coalition air campaign. The Obama administration's continued to authorize weapons sales to Saudi Arabia despite warnings last year from government lawyers that it might be considered a co-belligerent under international law.
And he extended the authorization for use of military force. The legislation passed in the wake of 9/11 authorizing the president to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determined planned, authorized, committed, or aided that attack, to include al-Shabaab in Somalia.
The United States obviously has been engaged in helping Somalia fight back against tribal terror and the challenges to the cohesion of the state of Somalia.
But although these escalations appeared to be a mere continuation of the war on terror that was sold to the public in the wake of 9/11, they were not. In fact, it quickly became apparent that a remarkable transition had begun to occur. Al-Qaeda, the ultimate face of evil and the undisputed enemy in the grand terror war narrative, were now the good guys, or at least serviceable allies, in the fight against the next target in the war on terror. This unbelievable turnaround had in fact begun during the Bush administration, when the neocons had started to set their sights on Iran. Being predominantly Shiite, Iran is in fact the enemy of the radical Wahhabis and Salafist Muslims that populate the ranks of Al-Qaeda and other Sunni terror groups. In targeting Iran, the US, like the British Empire before them, found it convenient to switch allegiances, arming, funding, and promoting the very radicals they had just been at war with in order to defeat their enemy of the moment. As Seymour Hersh reported in 2007, in the past few months, as the situation in Iraq has deteriorated, the Bush administration, in both its public diplomacy and its covert operations, has significantly shifted its Middle East strategy. The redirection, as some inside the White House have called the new strategy, has brought the United States closer to an open confrontation with Iran and, in parts of the region, propelled it into a widening sectarian conflict between Shiite and Sunni Muslims. To undermine Iran, which is predominantly Shiite, the Bush administration has decided, in effect, to reconfigure its priorities in the Middle East. A byproduct of these activities has been the bolstering of Sunni extremist groups that espouse a militant vision of Islam and are hostile to America and sympathetic to Al-Qaeda. As Hersh detailed in his articles on the redirection and preparing the battlefield, and as other mainstream sources eventually corroborated, this shift in Middle East strategy by the Bush administration included supporting Fatah al-Islam, a militant Islamic force led by a former associate of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, dedicated to spreading the ideology of Al-Qaeda in their struggle against Iranian ally and Israeli enemy, Hezbollah. Providing covert funds to the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, a strange cult of personality that, as a violent group of radicals that participated in bombings inside Iran, and even aided Mossad in assassinating Iranian scientists, was not merely lauded by the US, but openly promoted at gala events by neocons and their fellow travelers. Secretly backing opposition groups in Syria, one of Iran's most important regional allies, and supplying money and weapons to Jundullah, a group with close ties to Al-Qaeda, including reportedly being at one time headed by alleged 9/11 mastermind Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, that conducted raids into Iran from bases in Pakistan with covert CIA assistance. That these operations would have started under Bush and the neocons came as little surprise to those who knew anything about the real nature of the so-called war on terror. That they would be continued and even expanded under Obama, the ambassador of hope and change, was more surprising to those who did not yet grasp the true scale and scope of this war. No, The substance of the Bush redirection did not change under Obama. Only the tone and flavor of that policy changed. Obama did not win multiple advertising awards for his 2008 Hope and Change election campaign for nothing. As a shrewd salesman of an unpopular agenda, he knew that to get the public on board with such a radical shift in objectives, he was going to need an equally radical event to take place to tie a bow on the Osama bin Laden narrative and redirect the public's attention. And, on May 1st, 2011, that event occurred.
Senior Capitol Hill producer Chad Pergram confirms Osama bin Laden is dead. Senior Capitol Hill producer Chad Pergram confirms Osama bin Laden is dead. Can it be, ladies and gentlemen? Could it be?
Good evening. Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world.
Such a loser.
The United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al Qaeda, and a terrorist who's responsible for the murder of thousands of innocent men, women, and children.
Codenamed Operation Neptune Spear, the mission to kill bin Laden involved a daring team of Navy SEALs flying 2 stealth-modified Black Hawk helicopters from the Jalalabad military base in Afghanistan through Pakistani airspace straight to Abbottabad, the affluent military town where the world's most wanted man had evidently been living for years, evading the most comprehensive dragnet in history. Crash landing one of the choppers in the compound courtyard, a massive firefight broke out. The SEALs, clearing weapon stashes and barricades while fending off bin Laden's henchmen, made their way to the third-floor bedroom where the dastardly villain used one of his wives as a human shield. Shooting her in the leg to get her out of the way, the SEALs then managed to land 2 shots on their target, one hitting bin Laden in the head and the other in the chest, just as the terror kingpin was reaching for the gun he kept at the ready by his headboard. Making good their escape, the Navy SEAL heroes blew up their damaged helicopter while a standby chopper that had been prepared for the mission in case of an emergency flew in and whisked the remaining task force members out with bin Laden's body in tow. Returning to Bagram Air Base, bin Laden's body was immediately flown out to the USS Carl Vinson, where it was buried at sea in accordance with Islamic tradition.
Yeah, not compatible with Christianity.
And just like that, it was done. Public enemy number 1, the face of the war on terror, was dead, slain by the valiant Navy SEALs in a daring operation that was broadcast in real time to the White House Situation Room, where the Commander-in-Chief of the War of Terror, Barack Obama, and his iron-willed cabinet of terror warriors watched with steely determination. Indeed, this was not the stuff of history books, no dry, dusty tale of some minor police action or military operation. It may not have been the grand showdown in the cave fortress that the public had been prepared for, but, befitting the comic book supervillain of the War on Terror narrative, this was the stuff of Hollywood blockbusters.
Yep.
Geronimo. Forgotten country. Geronimo.
Yes, this was the stuff of Hollywood blockbusters. But, like a Hollywood blockbuster, the story of the raid was itself fiction. In fact, in the face of mild questioning by the generally deferential press, every single aspect of the confusing and often contradictory story that was told to the public in those euphoric hours after Obama's momentous announcement was proven to be a lie. There had been no firefight. Osama was not armed. He did not use his wife as a human shield. Burial at sea was not part of Islamic tradition. In fact, it was directly opposed to that tradition. Even the famous picture from the Situation Room was a lie. There had been no live video feed of the raid.
Yep.
But it wasn't just the details of the raid itself that had been a fabrication.
He was everything.
The entire story of the decade-long manhunt for Osama, dramatized in Oscar-winning movies like Zero Dark 30 and recounted in countless reports, books, and tell-alls, proved to be similarly fraudulent. In fact, the story began to fall apart from the very moment it was told to the public. But while most of the press remained content to pick at the corners of the story, leaving the substance of the narrative intact, others dug deeper, looking for answers amid the confusing confluence of lies, obfuscations, cover-ups, and contradictions that surrounded the raid. In a lengthy article for the London Review of Books in 2015 that, sourcing to unnamed retired officials with no direct knowledge of the events recounted, was about as solidly sourced as the official account, Seymour Hersh alleged that, while bin Laden had indeed been killed in Abbottabad, he had in fact been living at the compound as a prisoner of the ISI for years, and that every part of the official narrative of the raid, from the story of the Al-Qaeda courier by which the CIA allegedly discovered the compound, to the phony vaccination drive to collect bin Laden's DNA, to the burial at sea, was in fact an element of an elaborate, and seemingly unnecessary, cover story to obscure that fact. In a piece for The Independent the year after the raid, Patrick Coburn pointed out the inherent contradiction between early reports that the raid had uncovered a treasure trove of intelligence that portrayed bin Laden as a spider at the center of a conspiratorial web, and later admissions that he had had almost no contact with the outside world and was increasingly delusional about his organization and its capabilities. Others simply pointed out that, given this was at least the 9th occasion in which journalists, politicians, intelligence officials, or others had pronounced Osama bin Laden dead, it was not to be believed without evidence. But that evidence was not forthcoming. Instead, the government went to extraordinary lengths to cover it up. All the files from the raid, including copies of the death certificate and autopsy report for bin Laden, as well as the results of tests to identify the body, were deleted from the Pentagon's computers and transferred to the CIA, where they could be more carefully guarded from Freedom of Information Act requests. Pictures and video of the raid, including pictures of Osama bin Laden's dead body that, the public were told, may be released, were instead sealed away forever. At the time, all that was released were a few short videos of a man purported to be Osama bin Laden that, it was claimed, had been taken from the compound, although it was never explained why bin Laden would have poorly shot video of his back to the camera, watching himself on TV, and some salacious details about the records allegedly seized from the compound's computers, like the devout Muslim jihadi's predilection for porn, that seemed reminiscent of the CIA's previous wacky ideas for faking videos about Hussein and bin Laden. But CIA Director Leon Panetta did leak classified details of the raid at a 2011 awards ceremony attended by Mark Bowl, the screenwriter who would go on to write and produce Zero Dark 30, the Hollywood dramatization of the manhunt for Osama that portrayed the official version of the raid on the silver screen, and even falsely implied that the CIA's illegal torture program had been essential in helping to track down the terror kingpin. The full truth of what happened in Abbottabad, now obscured by lies, misinformation, selective leaks, self-serving tell-alls, and still classified data, will likely never see the light of day. But to the directors of the War of Terror, that is beside the point. Osama bin Laden had served his purpose as the villain in the terror war story. And, having served that purpose, he was being written out of the script. In the end, that was all Osama bin Laden had ever been. A character in the terror war drama. One so good that, if he didn't exist, they would have had to invent him.
Well, it's pretty obvious the judgment's coalescing around the president that it was Osama bin Laden. I know we live in a country where we're often told that the first thing that comes to your mind, put it down, put the little mark in there. I feel slightly uncomfortable because I spent so many years wondering how the myth of Osama bin Laden got started. We have the Osama bin Laden who was the great war hero. In Afghanistan, we have Osama bin Laden who was trained by CIA, funded and supported by CIA during 3 years of war. I was there at the same time bin Laden was there. He was not the great warrior that went and fought the Soviet Union to a standstill. CIA had nothing to do with him. I think that mythological Osama bin Laden, never mind that he's an absolutely evil man, but the mythological Osama bin Laden causes me trouble. And I think maybe there is another answer out there. I'm not certain that I know what it is.
There's no question in my mind that you're skeptical that Osama bin Laden, aided and abetted, or at least protected by the Taliban, should be the principal target of some large military operation. If I'm wrong about that, tell me now.
No, you're not wrong, Dan. I'm saying is, let me step back one step on this and say Osama bin Laden is an evil man, and he's a component of the terrorism that we're dealing with across the board. All I'm saying is that I think Osama bin Laden has become the metaphor for the entire problem of terrorism involving Muslims with perceived grievances against the United States. And I think it would be wrong to say this is a one-size-fits-all operation and to go after bin Laden, because an operation as sophisticated as carried out yesterday was an operation that was concealed from us for months, probably, before it took place. It happened without essentially a hitch except for one aircraft. And there is no reason to believe that these same people weren't capable of covering their tracks somehow on the way out. Now, I would go so far as to say that this group who was responsible for that, if they didn't have an Osama bin Laden out there, they'd invent one.
Yep.
Because he's a terrific diversion for the rest of the world.
The death of Osama bin Laden may have ended one chapter in the War on Terror, but it was not the end of the story. In a key sense, that story would simply repeat, with the rise of Al-Qaeda serving as a template that the terror war planners could draw upon as needed in their efforts to prolong their never-ending conflict indefinitely. The alignment with radical Islamists to achieve short-term geostrategic goals, a strategy refined by the British Empire over centuries of practice in the great game of global geopolitics, and reaching its apotheosis with the US operation to arm the Afghan Mujahideen in the 1980s, was simply employed once again as the US led its NATO allies in a humanitarian war against Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Former enemies in the War on Terror, including veterans of the Iraq insurgency who had been killing American troops in Iraq, and even designated terrorists who had been rendered and tortured by the CIA, were now the good guys, helping to overthrow Gaddafi's government in Libya. That same story played out yet again in Syria, where the US and its regional allies once again made a deal with the devil, this time in the name of toppling the government of Bashar al-Assad. Arming the most radical elements of these terror groups with US-procured weapons and training them at a US joint operation base in Jordan, it was not long before the Bush-era redirection of the terror war was complete, and Al-Qaeda was now widely recognized as a convenient ally of the US in Syria. In 2012, Council on Foreign Relations senior fellow Ed Hussein wrote of Al-Qaeda's specter in Syria, noting that the Syrian rebels would be immeasurably weaker today without Al-Qaeda in their ranks. In 2014, a trio of foreign policy experts published a piece for the CFR on the good and bad of Ahrar al-Sham, an Al-Qaeda-linked group worth befriending. And in 2015, Barak Mendelsohn, writing in the pages of the same Foreign Affairs magazine in which Philip Zelikow and his co-authors had predicted the terror war, penned Accepting Al-Qaeda, the Enemy of the United States Enemy, in which he argued, since 9/11, Washington has considered Al-Qaeda the greatest threat to the United States, one that must be eliminated regardless of cost or time. After Washington killed Osama bin Laden in 2011, it made Ayman al-Zawahiri, Al-Qaeda's new leader, its next #1 target. But the instability in the Middle East following the Arab revolutions and the meteoric rise of the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham require that Washington rethink its policy toward Al-Qaeda, particularly its targeting of Zawahiri. Destabilizing Al-Qaeda at this time may in fact work against US efforts to defeat ISIS. In conclusion, Mendelsohn writes flatly, it is certainly ironic that at this point, when the United States is the closest it has ever been to destroying Al-Qaeda, its interests would be better served by keeping the terrorist organization afloat and Zawahiri alive. Such arguments, unthinkable during the bin Laden years, were suddenly not only thinkable, but were being openly promoted in Beltway foreign policy think tank circles. That such a dramatic turnaround could even be considered, let alone advocated, so soon after the years-long propaganda campaign portraying Al-Qaeda as an existential threat to the West, is only surprising to those who were ignorant of the real history of Al-Qaeda and the real origins of the terror war. To those who did know this history, the fact that those in the State Department's orbit were now openly calling for accommodation of, and even alliance with, Al-Qaeda came as no surprise. And it similarly came as no surprise that this alliance led, exactly as it had in Afghanistan in the 1980s, to the rise of a new terror group, the Islamic State.
ISIS, an al-Qaeda-bred terrorist group spreading its wings online. Savvier than its predecessors with a new array of tricks up its sleeves.
They have rampaged across cities and villages, killing innocent, unarmed civilians.
The threat from this ISIS group beyond
Just like
just
the
that
IDF?
region, reaching into the rest of the world.
Huh? Just like the IDF?
Rising from the ashes of the same Al-Qaeda in Iraq that had been led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the U.S. military's self-proclaimed most successful information campaign to date, the Islamic State rose to international prominence in 2014 when it captured Raqqa in Syria and began a campaign that saw it take over Mosul and Tikrit in northern Iraq before announcing the establishment of a caliphate. As a convenient justification for re-engaging the American military in Iraq, and as another excuse for military intervention in Syria, it was only later that the truth began to emerge. Not only had the U.S. armed and trained these very ISIS fighters that they were now engaged in mortal struggle with, and not only had the U.S.'s own Defense Intelligence Agency precisely predicted the rise of an Islamic State in this area of Syria and Iraq 2 years before it happened, but U.S.-led forces repeatedly stood down as ISIS convoys moved unimpeded, allowing them to take Ramadi in 2015 and allowing a convoy of stranded ISIS fighters to return home in 2017. The career of the group's new leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, followed the now familiar terror boogeyman pattern. Like his predecessor Zarqawi, Baghdadi was pronounced dead, alive, arrested, dead, and alive again so often that news of his actions quickly descended into farce. Detained by U.S. forces at Camp Bucca in Iraq in 2004, he was reportedly arrested again in March 2007 and killed in May of that year, before being arrested yet again in 2009 and killed yet again in 2010, at which point even the Times was forced to concede that the arrest or death of Mr. Baghdadi, the insurgent fighter, has been reported so many times that it has become a macabre joke. But he was not done yet. He was reported to have died in an Israeli hospital in April of 2015, then killed in an airstrike in October 2015, and killed again by the Russians in June 2017, before the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights released a statement insisting he really is dead this time in July 2017. Yet still he continued to reappear, reliably resurrected in the headlines of the establishment press to terrorize the public as needed until the final report of his death in 2019. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the announcement of this, the final death of this remarkably resilient terror mastermind, carefully staged to bring to mind Obama's dramatic announcement of the death of Osama bin Laden and to rally the country around the flag once again.
Last night, the United States brought the world's #1 terrorist leader to justice.
October 27th.
Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is dead.
Is that few in the public seemed even to notice that it had taken place. And, in 2022, when Biden took his turn as the conquering hero, announcing the death of Ayman al-Zawahiri.
My fellow Americans, on Saturday, my direction, the United States successfully concluded an airstrike in Kabul, Afghanistan, that killed the emir of Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri.
Again, it was greeted by a collective shrug. Few in the public even knew Zawahiri's name, let alone gave him much thought. For a world that had just lived through 2 decades of near-daily assurances that Al-Qaeda was so existential a threat to human civilization that it justified a worldwide, never-ending war on terror of unlimited scope, this was nothing short of remarkable. The war of terror, it seemed, might end not with a bang, but a whimper. For the families of Zamari Ahmadi and all the millions whose blood was spilled in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, and all the other lands that have been torn apart by the senseless carnage of the past 2 decades, the growing apathy of the American public to the terror war narrative may come as cold comfort. But to those who have spent decades living under the shadow of the ever-present terror fear-mongering, cynically wielded by politicians and governments to keep their populations cowering under the weight of color-coded terror threats, the rejection of the terror war narrative is undeniably a turning point. But even if the public, having snapped out of the Al-Qaeda delusion, are content to move on with their lives and to prepare to live in a post-terror world, the terror warriors have other plans. What many in the public have failed to realize is that the war of terror was never really about Osama bin Laden. It was never really about Al-Qaeda. It wasn't about radical Muslims. At base, it wasn't even about geopolitical goals or reshaping the map of the Middle East. It was about us.
The Obama administration's internal legal justification for assassinating U.S. citizens without charge has been revealed for the first time.
I don't know. If the president's going to kill these people, he needs to let them know. Some of the people who might be terrorists are people who are missing fingers. Some people have stains on their clothing. Some people have changed the color of their hair.
This was no mere protest gone awry. It was what they used to care about most on the right, the worst kind of planned violence, terrorism.
These are not acts of peaceful protest, but really domestic terror.
The assistant director of the FBI's counterterrorism division told Congress that the Bureau currently has 850 open domestic terror cases. Half of those are anti-government or anti-authority extremists.
And this was what DHS decided to put out in a bulletin, that now if you have COVID misinformation that they classify misinformation, you are a domestic terrorist.
Yeah.
First, we are broadening the scope of Canada's anti-money laundering and terrorist financing rules so that they cover crowdfunding platforms and the payment service providers they use.
There is little cultural overlap between violent extremists abroad and violent extremists at home. But then there's disdain for pluralism, in their disregard for human life, in their determination to defile national symbols. They are children of the same foul spirit, and it is our continuing duty to confront them.
There, just below the surface of the war on terror story that was sold to the public, the story of radical, freedom-hating Muslims and cowardly terror attacks and crusading presidents flanked by their valiant Navy SEALs, is another story. As if written in invisible ink between the lines of the history of Al-Qaeda is the story of the Patriot Act and the Department of Homeland Security, of the TSA and biometric screening and domestic terror watch lists. It is the story of the creation of an entire infrastructure of legal measures and emergency powers that have quietly transformed the face of the so-called free world. The terror myth has always served primarily as a tool of domestic control. It is a blank check for every government to enact whatever controls it desires over its population in the name of security. And the public, convinced of the need for that security by the terror war myth itself, clamors for more government controls. The problem feeds upon itself. There is only one way to break out of such a vicious circle. The underlying premise of the entire terror war has to be called out for what it is: a lie. In the end, perhaps this is how the war of terror really ends. Not with the toppling of the Taliban, or a mission-accomplished photo op on the deck of an aircraft carrier, or the announcement of the death of the arch-terror mastermind, or even by presidential declaration. Not by these or any of the other illusory endpoints that the terror warriors dangle in front of the public from time to time, only to snatch away when grasped at. No. The war of terror ends when the public, having learnt the secret history of Al-Qaeda, decide to consign the real terror threat, the myth of Al-Qaeda, to the dustbin of history.
That was so good. I'll just put on my light. All right, stop sharing. All right. Oh, my video is off. Hello, everyone. Oh, I'm so high up. Whee! Okay, that was a good video. People are still asleep, so I'm just trying to get some videos out of the way. Not out of the way. Before people get up, and then I'm going to make a nice breakfast. But there is another. It's not letting me share it. But there is another. Hello. Sorry about that. There's another video. While people are still asleep or in the rooms, I want to share. Israel's second 9/11, How Zionism Conquered JFK, America, and Palestine by Matthew Tower.
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
To be in deception, to be in fear, to be deceived is a much worse place to be than to have some truth. Like it says in the Bible, the truth will set you free.
And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free.
Here's an Israeli confessing the truth.
Washington is Israel's most subservient colony.
The government's been taken over. The date, I say it was concrete that there was.
All right. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this a separate video. This is very important. I'm going to be right back on. But on that note, I'm going to leave it at that. And I hope that everyone, if you don't come back and watch this other video, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.